So this is the last week in our series on Mark. We've been going through every chapter of Mark. Next week we're going to hit at the movies, and you'll hear more about that at the end. Chapter 14 is where we are today. You can get ready and turn there. That's not the last chapter of Mark, but it's the last chapter we're doing because if you remember, as we went chapter by chapter, when we got to Easter, we jumped ahead and went to the Easter sections of Mark, and then we went back to finish what we had started, and so we're in chapter 14. So at Journey Church, we have 6 values that influence our culture. They influence what we do and how we do it. They help keep us focused on our theme of this year of walking deeper and reaching wider. I love our core values. I'm pretty passionate about our core values. I know I'm biased. I just think that they're great. The first one that I'm going to share with you in just a moment happens to be about passion. And let me read it to you. We will passionately worship, serve, and give to God from all of our resources. We will dream big dreams and expect big things from our God who can do far more than we can ever imagine. I love that. I love that. It's about passion and it's about worship. In Mark chapter 14, where we're going to look today, that's what we're going to see. We're going to see a scripture that shows that kind of passion, that shows 3 incidents of worship and some elements of worship. 2 of them are kind of twisted up. They're not really good worship. 1 of them is really good worship. All 3 of them will show an element, 2 major components of what worship is in, what was contained in worship. There's 2 things, as we'll get to the definition of worship, but I want you, before I read the passage, I want you to think about kind of the theme of this morning. That good worship, that's what we're going to talk about this morning, includes attitude and action. An attitude and action. Worship involves an attitude of submission. And then once we submit ourselves in worship, then in order for worship to have the fullest impact on our life, then it results in action, or we do something. It's not just an attitude of submission, it's an act of submission. So as I read from Mark chapter 14, verses 1 through 9, I want you to think about those 2 words and see if you can spot as we're going through where you see attitude, an attitude of submission, and you see action as a result of that attitude. So starting in verse 1. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. While Jesus was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came in with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." And thus it is so this morning. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So we have 3 incidents there that show what people worship. Worship is what we're focusing on, and we're going to learn that there's those elements of worship, and we want to look at the 2 bad ones, and then we're going to focus on the good ones. So the first bad worship, that not a good form of worship, was from the chief priests and the teachers of the law. So what they were worshiping was kind of the status quo religious practices, rules, and regulations that they were used to. They were entwined and entrenched. They even had social status that was bound up in these proper ways to worship. They clung to the Old Testament law, and they added 660-something other laws to it. And to them, those were the good and proper parts of worship, and that is what you did. So they had the attitude of submission toward those things, but then they were able and willing to take it into action, not just in their life, but you saw the action they were willing to take, strong action, to plot the murder of a man who was coming against what they had deemed proper and good worship, to actually plan a murder, but to plan it at the right time as to not cause too much trouble and cause a riot. That was their distorted form of worship. They had an attitude of submission to the law, and then they took some action because they clung to the law so tightly. The second one that we saw was the woman. We're going to focus on her in just a little bit, so stick a pin in that. We'll spend more time in a few minutes on her. Let's go to the third person, who is Judas Iscariot. So he worshiped two things, as we see in here. He was a zealot, which means that he was all into governmental reform. He wanted Rome out of there, and he wanted Israel to be ruled by themselves. And Jesus, he thought, was the one who was going to do that. And Jesus wasn't doing it quick enough. And Jesus wasn't doing it in the ways that he thought he should do it. And so he took some action. So his first point of worship was this government deorganization and replacement. The next thing that he worshiped was money. He was one in the other Gospels that was the most upset about this wasteful act of worship that this woman did, and he wanted to take that and sell it and use that money. He was the money keeper of the group, and as you read in other places, he actually took some of that money for himself underhandedly. So he had two things he worshiped: government reform and money. It was all twisted up. And he found this perfect and evil marriage of those two things coming together as he sold out Jesus for cash. So all three of these have this thing in common, what they're passionate for and what they worship. So we're going to spend some time first looking at what worship is, and then we'll look at how we can practice good worship. So what is worship? First question, what is worship? Worship has been around since people have been around. Ever since there's been people, there's been worship. In all of human history, if you go look at other ruins and other buildings, you see that they built places of worship because people always have submitted themselves, acknowledged a higher power, a higher force, a higher person that was more powerful than them, and they submitted themselves to that person or that thing in worship. Even in Greece, Tina and I got to go there a few years ago. One of the oldest buildings in Greece that's still standing and intact. What do you think it was built for? For this purpose, because people have always worshiped. So Adam and Eve, they started worshiping right at the beginning. If you read the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis, as they are doing their thing, they're worshiping God in two ways. One, they're thankful for the provision, this wonderful garden, all these things that God provided for them. And it says that they fellowshiped with him, that they were with him. So they worshiped him in a relationship. In chapter 3 of Genesis, it says that this was a regular occurrence in their experience with God. They worshiped him by having a relationship with him, by being with him. But then, we know the story, they misbehaved, they acted outside of God's good intentions for them, and they did what God asked them not to do, and we get a new form of worship entering into the story at that point. Do you know what that form of worship was? It was worship asking for forgiveness for what they had done. Before that, it was just this relationship thing, just being with God. After they acted outside of what God wanted for them, they added this need for forgiveness, and they were going to God to get something. So it shifted from giving something to God to getting something from God. That's what can happen to us. You know, if you think about being a parent, when your kids, no matter what age they are, whether they're small or they're grown, when your kids just want to spend time with you, just to be with you, isn't that kind of heartwarming? It's a good thing, yeah? At least one mom's over there smiling. But then when your kids are hanging out with you and a few minutes into it, when your heart's getting warm, suddenly it gets a little cold because you realize that they really just wanted something from you. They wanted you to open your wallet or your purse, or they wanted the keys, or they wanted something else. And what does that do to that relationship? They wanted something. They didn't just want to be with you. And I think that's what can happen with worship when we think about God. Rather than worshiping him just to be with him, we can worship God because we want something from him. So today, as we go through this, I hope that we can grab onto a little bit of that part of worship, that it's not what we can get from God. It's just simply because he is God, and we worship him for that. Would you pray with me and see if we can get there today? God, we thank you that you are worth our worship just because of who you are. Then there's all these other things. We can worship you because of what you've made. We can worship you because you love us. We can worship you because of the things you provide for us. But you are just God, and we should just worship you. So help us to deal with some of the things in our lives that compete for worshiping you. Let us keep you and put you in your proper place. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen. So, like I like to have teaching aids. So today I have a live teaching aid. This is Alex. He is our worship arts pastor. He's been here for 2 months. Woohoo! Yay! Yay! Yeah, he's the deal, the real deal. So I wanted us to hear from him because sometimes it's just good to hear from the ones that lead us in worship what they feel about worship. So I have some questions that I asked him. So he's done some prepping. So he's getting that ready. So first, how would you define what worship is?
Right. So, in my opinion, which this is somewhat professional, as after all, this is my job. So, in my opinion, worship it's our calling, it's our purpose, it's what we were created to do. I mean, we don't worship out of our own desires, but we worship for His. It's an inward and an outward expression of our gratitude, our faith, and our trust in Christ. And it's not just about singing or music that has a role, that has a place, but it's not just about that. Worship is about glorifying God with both our hearts and our voices. Worship should be our natural response when we enter into God's presence.
Cool. Good answer. So we come here on Sunday and we worship. So what part of our Sunday experience would you say is worship?
Well, Sundays in general, some of us just getting out of bed could be considered worship. I mean, it's our day off, It's like just getting out is a good thing. But, I mean, getting here, any moment spent in church should be classified as a worship moment. I mean, you're freely coming to a sacred place to meet with Christ and dive deeper into our faith and what it means to serve Him.
Okay, so is worship more about giving or about receiving? And here's where I really want to go. So how do preferences, like musical preferences, figure into worship?
Yeah. So in many ways, worship is both giving and receiving, because you come to this place, you give your time, you give your possessions, you give up parts of you while you're here. So you're giving that to Him, and even your cares, you give all of that to Him, all of your struggles and stuff. But also, it's about receiving, because when you worship, you receive a sense of peace and power and purpose, while you're doing this. It's not something that we just do and we don't receive anything. God shows up, And so, I mean, it's definitely both giving and receiving. Preferences are always going to be a thing. Everybody has their preferences. I have my own, it's just everybody's going to have them. Anything from, content, speakers, singers, music choices, lights, just about anything, or even volume level. It doesn't matter what it is. Everybody's going to have their preferences, and they all help us get into a worshipful mood. But in reality, all those preferences need to take a backseat versus, or in reality, because is God receiving glory? Is God receiving all the glory during our Sunday experience? Because that's what it truly comes down to. As long as His name is being lifted and we understand that He is worthy of all of our praise, that's what matters.
Okay, so we come here on Sunday, we spend an hour or so worshiping, all the elements of worship. How does that overflow? How do you see that overflowing into our life after we leave here?
Yeah, so I say it all the time, worship starts at home. It's not something that you start here, it's something that you bring with you. It's a mindset. It's not a mood, and it's not a phase. It's a mindset. You're going to wake up. You're going to choose that in every aspect and all facets of life, you are going to worship. So it's a mindset that you bring into this, but that transfers into everyday life in the sense of all the relationships that you build. So I have a network of worship leaders and worship pastors, and some are even just pastors, that we get together. We FaceTime. We have like a conference FaceTime thing, and we just talk about things that are going on in our ministries, ups, downs, tips, tricks to make our lives easier, stuff like that. But it always ends up translating to life in general and not our jobs. It translates to just us building relationships with each other, and kind of the same thing, tips, tricks, ups and downs, how can we help each other, do stuff like that. And that, in building relationships with people, you start to realize that that is a form of worship because you're interacting with others and God is receiving glory.
Cool. So that's all the questions for him. You can clap in a second. I just want to tell you something. He got creeped out on the first service. This guy here's the real deal. So he really is. He is conscientious about worship. He lives and breathes it. So yesterday I got notified on my phone because when some people come in, it tells me when the alarm's turned off. And there's like secret cameras in here. So just be aware if you're ever in here by yourself. And so I saw someone came in the church, so I was looking to see who it was. And so there's a camera that is over by the sound booth. So Alex is there doing what he just said, meeting with a guy or two on the phone on his FaceTime, talking about these questions so that he could be prepared to talk with you about worship. And I only listened to a few minutes because Tina told me I should probably let him have private. So let's give him a hand. So Alex gave us some good things to think about worship. I want to give you a definition of some worship. So what is worship? If you trace the word back, or English word back, the word worship actually is worthship. Just that little difference. So it's about worthiness, worshiping something that is worthy. And there's two parts of it. I wonder if you can guess what the two parts are. I already told you what they are. It's attitude and action. So the first part of the definition is that something is worth our devotion. So we have reverent devotion, and we put ourselves in a posture of submission. That's the attitude part of worship. The second part of the definition is service. So we have a reverent devotion and service to something that we deem worthy of that. So we don't just have an attitude. We don't just feel something. We actually do something. In order for worship to be fully manifest in our life, it leads us to action. So good worship engages both attitude and action. I think many times we can focus just on that first part, that attitude part, the reverent devotion part. But by definition, worship has both parts. It's observation and activation. We're not just observing things about God, but because we observe things about God, we're inspired to go do things because of how we feel about God. We don't just ponder God when we worship, we act on what we pondered about God. Those are the two parts, attitude and action. And we're going to see that from the woman who anointed Jesus for his burial, that wasted the perfume in an act of worship, that she did both of those things. She had a submissive attitude toward Jesus. She recognized who he was, the Messiah. She recognized what he was going to do for her, and she worshiped him. And she sacrificed. She didn't just have a posture of submission. She activated something. She grabbed something that was valuable to her and actually valuable to those around her, and she gave it as an act of devotion and an act of worship to her Messiah. And Jesus commended her for it. She worshiped by both submitting her attitude and taking action. So this is where we come so far. Worship is an expression from us towards something or someone that we deem super worthy, more important, and more powerful than us. In our case, it's God, Jesus. And because we deem that thing or that person as super worthy, we become super devoted to it. And because we become super devoted to it, that starts to overflow into action that is usually sacrificial on our part. We give up things to honor the one that is worth honoring. But I think we get confused. Sometimes I get confused about worship. Sometimes we get confused about why we worship. Oftentimes, we can run into the Adam and Eve thing at the beginning. Rather than worshiping because of worthiness, we worship because of wantingness. A little play on words, do you see it there? Because of things that we want. And then so we want something from this thing that we've decided is more powerful than us. And so we focus on the things that we want. And then what can start to happen is we start to worship the things we want, not just the thing we want them from. So I was thinking about that. We get confused about not only why we worship, but what we worship. And I was thinking about my life, about our life, kind of our culture, and the things that could compete for worship. And I came up with a little list that I'm working on. Some of the things that we want are material things. So as we desire these things for our life, and maybe even sometimes acquire these things for our life, we can cross over a line and actually kind of start to worship those things that we've decided we want in our life. There's a couple obvious things. like cars. We're a culture that really likes cars. Cars can become too important to us. And not that I struggle with this. Bikes could be a thing. I only have 4 of them in my garage that are mine and 1 that's Tina's. It has its proper place in my life. It's not idolatry. But sometimes material things are what we can tend to worship. What about security things? Sometimes we desire security items in our life, things that bring us security, and we start to worship those things. Things like our jobs. Those can be things that can cross over into something that we worship. Money, our houses, those types of things that bring us security. What about image things? Things that make us look good. So our need to have something good and to have a good and powerful self-image starts to get the esteem of ourselves, and we start to worship that, and we cross over, and we worship appearance things like Botox faces and chiseled physiques. I could pose for you, but I won't. And a nice reputation in our circle of friends, or things like that that are more image things, and that starts to be the things that we give more attention to than God, and we swing over and start to worship those. And the last thing I thought of is our ego things, are things that make us feel good, not look good, but things that make us feel good. They give us good feelings. So what we start to do is we desire those good feelings, and we revere those good feelings, and we start to worship things that make us feel good. So here's a hint on the whole ego worship thing. How do you do when you fail at some things? I think that's the big test of ego worship. Like being a great parent. That's a good and noble thing. We should aspire to that. None of us has a goal to be a bad parent. But how do you do when you feel like you failed, when you feel like you have bad kids, or that your kids did a bad thing, and you start to take that personally as a reflection of you as a parent, and it starts to derail you? What about being a great friend? All of us want to be great friends. We don't have a goal of being a bad friend. But when we discover, when our friends tell us that we weren't there for them and we weren't a good friend, how do you feel about that? Or what about your job? We'll take mine, for example. Being a good pastor is important to me. When I mess up, when I fall short, or when I disappoint you, when I'm not there for you, it can derail me. It can mess with me. But I've never done that, so I don't really know how that feels. That was just an example. I bet you could come up with your own list of things that start to compete for your worship. Those things, all these things I've talked about are okay things. They're appropriate things to have in our life. It's just as those things start to cross over in our lives and become the object of our worship, that God is not in the right place in our life, that it runs into problems. God knew that it was going to be a problem for us. He knew that he would have competition. God of the whole universe knew that he would have competition. The first 3 commandments in the Old Testament tell us that he knew he would have competition. The first 3 commandments, pop quiz. You know the first one? I have to look too. Let's look at them together. The first one, you shall have no other gods but me. The first one. He knew that we'd be tempted to put other gods in his place. Second one, you shall not make for yourself any idol, nor bow down to any mountain bikes and worship them. He knew that there was a potential for us to place things in our life that we would actually worship. And the third thing, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Do not exploit God or Jesus for personal gain. He knew that there was going to be competition. So humans don't have a problem with worshiping because we have always worshiped. That's not the issue. Worship more. But the problem is that when things take the place of the only one who should be worshiped, as Alex said, you could say that we are made to worship. Do you stop and realize we are the creatures on earth that worship? I love my dogs. My dogs love me, and sometimes I can attach some of these weird human attributes to my dogs, but my dogs don't set aside time to worship Jesus. They don't even set aside time to worship me. They just like to be with me because I give them things. We're the only creatures on earth, besides angels, that worship God. It's distinctly one of the things we are actually created to do. So we're not supposed to worship anything than God. How do we manage that? How do we guard ourselves into not worshiping unworthy things? How can we do it? Well, the woman that we read about gives us 3 examples, easy examples from this chapter 14 of Mark that I want to go over with you on how we can worship well. So what does good worship look like? There's 3 things that good worship expresses. Good worship expresses our belief in someone safe. Our belief in someone safe. So worship involves submitting our vulnerabilities. And what I mean by that, it involves submitting our doubts, submitting our questions, submitting our hurts to Jesus, who is loving and trustworthy and worthy to hear those things from us in a world that has a tendency to discount our doubts, to not listen to our questions, and to ignore our hurts. But that's not Jesus. Jesus doesn't do those things. This woman in this chapter of Mark felt safe enough to go to Jesus vulnerably in a patriarchal culture that did not treat women the way that our culture treats women. She took so many risks. She came up to Jesus, which is not what a woman should do. She touched Jesus, which is not what a woman should do, and she wasted some valuable assets, perfume, on worshiping Jesus. She took lots of risks, but she felt safe with Jesus to do that. So how can you do that? We probably don't have some nard. Don't bring some nard next week and stick it in the basket at the end of the service. But we can do other things. So how can we express our belief that Jesus is someone safe for us? Good worship trusts Jesus with your doubts, your questions, and your hurts. Be like that woman with a submissive posture and go to Jesus with those things that are going on in your life. Have conversations with Jesus about those things. He can handle those things. He knows those things about you anyways, and trust him with it. And then the other one, believe what God says about you. This is a hard one for me. I can tell you all the time, believe what God says about you, but I struggle with it too. So my friend Lindsay, she's in the front row, I'm calling her out in a good way. She posted something on Facebook yesterday. I was looking at my notes yesterday afternoon, and you posted a video by Lauren Daigle. That song that is You Say, it's in the secular charts too now. She's a Christian singer that's crossed over. And it's this wonderful song where it talks about, I'm believing who you say that I am. The world says this, but you say that. And the world says this, but you say that. And Lindsay, as you said that to me, it moved me in worship because I was looking at it and I was thinking about this woman. I was picturing this woman pouring oil on Jesus in a submissive posture, saying these things to him. Because I bet she had a past. I bet there was a reason she was so emotional in her worship. And I pictured her saying these things. And then, I know you're going to think I'm all weird, but I got all worshipy. And I started crying because then I pictured me at the feet of Jesus. Because I have a past too. And I think about these things that Jesus says about me. And I thought, what a cool exercise this could be for me to think about a song like that when I hear it at the feet of Jesus, worshiping him because I believe who he says I am, not who I say I am, and not even who others say that I am. So good worship expresses our belief in someone, capital S, who is safe. The next thing we see from the woman. Good worship expresses our belief in someone visionary, someone that has vision for us. So worshiping God, worshiping Jesus, means that we believe that he is taking us somewhere good. Now, a lot of times in worship, we might think of taking us somewhere good for eternity, that we know the end of the story, and it's a really good story when Jesus returns and makes everything good and perfect and right, including me. And that's a part of this. But the other part of this is here and now in this life. When I leave here tomorrow, believing that Jesus is visionary in my life, visionary enough in my life that he's taking me somewhere good. Even when I have a hard week or a confusing week or bad things come into my life, I can trust that Jesus is someone visionary, that it's at least passed through his hands to come into my life, but that he can take those bad, confusing things in my life and take me somewhere good with those things. That's how I can practice believing in someone visionary. So that's what you can do. How can you practice? Practice and trust that Jesus is leading you in your life. Even when it seems like things are chaotic and things aren't the way you want them to be. Don't pull a Judas Iscariot and start to do your own thing and come up with your own plans. Practice following Jesus leading. The other thing is practice watching for open windows and shut doors. A lot of times we talk about that in life, not just in spirituality or in our walk with Jesus, that God opens doors, or a door seemed open, so I walked through it, or a window was closed, so I didn't go there. So let's watch for those things. But this is where I'm practicing. Sometimes I think that by faith, if we really believe that Jesus is taking us somewhere visionary, and we see that God opens a door, Or he points to a door, that door over there, Carlo, that's where I want you to go. And so I'll go, cool, Jesus, but it's not open yet. Would you open that door for me? Sometimes he doesn't open the door for me. He just points out the door. And as I practice worshiping Jesus, someone who's visionary for my life, I walk to the door and I open the door. Or he points to a window in my life that's open that should be closed. And he tells me I should go close that window. That should not be in my life. And that's a submissive act of worship. The third thing we see from this woman is good worship expresses our belief in someone inclusive. That last part that Jesus says, the story is going to be told for eons and eons, and thus here we are this morning talking about it. She expressed a belief that Jesus was going to take her somewhere and take other people with her. And here we are today. So that's what we are, being part of something for all people for all time. This is not just for us in this happy little church group that we're having this morning. So we need to practice that the story, God encroaching on people's life, is not an exclusive club. It's inclusive. It's for people around you. Practicing inviting Jesus into people's life. Help them to see Jesus as a part of their life. We are calling that this year reaching wider. And what that means with reaching wider is we have an open hand of invitation and an open arm of encouragement. So this is how I picture it. That we have an open arm of encouragement, that we are just encouraging to the people around us, not just the people in this room, but people in our neighborhoods, people in our families, people in our workplace. And it's like a half hug, where we just want to encourage them through their hard times and give them some hope. And once in a while, maybe we'll get to talk about the Bible or Jesus. And that's when we offer the open hand of invitation, where we bring them along into some awareness of God in their life, his provision for them, or maybe even bring them to church. But there's no strings attached. We just want to be an encouragement to them. I have an example for you. So as I tell you this, don't get all judgy on me. Some of you might think, Carla, you do that? So you know I mountain bike. Have I mentioned that this morning already? So I mountain bike, and there's a Bible study group of men that I'm a part of on Tuesday nights. It's called 4Bs. The first 2 Bs are body and bikes, because we're trying to stay fit and trim. It's not an idle thing. It's appropriate. And then after the bike, we go to someone's house in the neighborhood, and we rotate to different people's houses. And the last 2 Bs are beer and the Bible. So that can come together. So we drink a beer. There's no drunkenness. It's not a party. But we do a Bible study together. And what's so cool is I've been invited as a part of this group, is every week, I don't know if you know this or remember this, but every week we write questions that have to do with the teaching on Sunday morning, and we post them with our YouTube video of the message. So every week you can go deeper. What this group has allowed me and another friend to do is we take the questions from our messages on Sunday and take them to this group. There's only 2 people in that group that are from our church, and there's about 18 guys that were there just this last week. Half of the guys do not go to church and probably do not have a relationship with Jesus, but they let us talk to them about the Bible each and every week. Last week, if you remember, we talked about end times. It was an interesting conversation. People that don't have a relationship with Jesus, talking about how the world is going to end and how we feel like Jesus is going to rescue the world and regenerate it. It was interesting. It shapes and influences the way I reach out to the world, reaching wider. That's what I'm working on. A couple of them have come to church. Most of them haven't. Maybe they'll come to church. Maybe they'll go to some other church. But all I know is that they're giving me the opportunity to reach wider, and eventually maybe I'll be able to invite them to church, and they'll be here. So that's what I'm going to focus on, just reaching wider, because I believe that Jesus invites us into something that's inclusive, not exclusive. So Alex and I talked this week about how to end our service today. And so I'm going to tell you one last story, and we're going to end it with a song, a worship song. So there's this song that we sing here that reminds me of what I'm trying to get across to you, that we should just worship God because he's worth it, not because of what I can get from God. So you might know a few weeks ago, some of us from church here went on a Grand Canyon hike. We did a rim to rim to rim, which is like really hard if you don't know, super, super hard. And it was a fundraiser for one of the organizations that we support, the Hope Effect, which is changing the way the world treats and responds to orphans. So we did this big old hike, and as we started the hike, one of my friends, Joel Thurston, played this song for me, the song that we're going to sing. And he told me how the year prior, when he did this hike and he was coming up out of the Grand Canyon by himself with just the stars shining, this was the song that he was playing. So he played it for us as we started. And so as I was walking up out of the canyon, hours and hours and hours later, it was dark by then. We started when it was dark, we ended when it was dark. And this song kept coming to my mind. I was in this immense place, the immensity I was within, but I was worshiping God because of the intimacy that I was in. It was a moment. I kind of hope that maybe, in a way, you can have a moment like that now, where you can think about the bigness of the world, but yet God is with you, and that makes him worth worshiping. So let's worship together.
Start before the beginning of time. With no point of reference, you spoke to the dark and fleshed out the wonder of life. And as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. In the vapor of your breath, the planets form. If the stars were made to worship, so I can see your heart in everything you've made. Every burning star, a signal fire of grace. If creation sings your praises, so will I.
Would you stand and worship with us?
God of your promise, you don't speak in vain, no syllable empty or void. For once you have spoken, all nature and science follow the sound of your voice. And as you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath, evolving in pursuit of what you said. If it all reveals your nature, so will I can see your heart in everything you say. Every painted sky, a canvas of your grace. If creation still obeys you, so will I. So will I. So will I. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. If the mountains bow in reverence, so will I. If the oceans roar your greatness, so will I. For if everything exists to lift you high, so will I. If the wind goes where you send it, so will I. If the rocks cry out in silence, so will I. If the sum of all our praises still falls shy, then we'll sing again 100 billion God of salvation, you chased down my heart through all of my failure and pride. On a hill you created, the light of the world, abandoned in darkness to die. And as you speak, 100 billion failures disappear. Where you lost your life so I could find it here. If you left the grave behind you, so will I can see your heart in everything you've done. Every part designed in a work of art called love. If you gladly chose surrender, so will I can see your heart a billion different ways. Every precious one, a child you died to save. If you gave your life to love them, so like you would again 100 billion times. What measure could amount to your desire? The one who never leaves the one behind. God, we thank you for showing up this morning. We thank you for the words that were spoken. We pray that you will mold our hearts and mold our minds and let us know what it truly means to worship you, what it truly means to give you the glory. I pray that you'll speak to us and let your will be done in all aspects of our life. For all that you do, we're going to give you praise. Amen. You may